This widespread unemployment is having a ripple effect on health insurance nationwide. A study from the Economic Policy Institute estimates 12 million Americans lost their health care coverage due to job loss associated with the pandemic between February and July. The Affordable Care Act was President Obama's landmark policy achievement. It expanded access to health care coverage to millions of Americans. The Supreme Court is expected to hear a challenge to the law later this fall. It could eliminate it altogether. That is part of why the confirmation hearings for Judge Amy Coney Barrett have been so contentious.
Have you committed to the President or anyone else that you will vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act if confirmed by to the court?
Absolutely not. I was never asked, and if I had been, that would have been a short conversation.
Were you aware of President Trump's opposition to the Affordable Care Act during that time?
Senator Klobuchar, I have no idea, and I suspect that if the article was published in January, that I wrote it sometime before the presidential election. And again, I want to stress, I have no animus to or agenda for the Affordable Care Act. I'm not here on a mission to destroy the Affordable Care Act.
Rob Henneke joins me now from Austin, Texas. He's the general counsel for the conservative Texas Public Policy Foundation, which joined the Texas-led lawsuit against the ACA. Rob, thanks very much for joining us. Millions of Americans rely on the Affordable Care Act for coverage. The pandemic has only increased those numbers. Why do you want it struck down?
Elaine, good evening, and thank you for having me on Red and Blue. The case before the Supreme Court challenges the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. And that's the focus of our goal, is that because it is unconstitutional for the federal government to command individuals like my clients to purchase expensive health insurance that they don't want, that doesn't provide them with a doctor of their choice, that leads to rationing of care, that is beyond the power of the federal government and is unconstitutional. And because that individual mandate is the central concept in the Affordable Care Act, legally that renders the entirety of the Affordable Care Act to be invalid. And it's the role of Congress to go back to the legislature and to pass a constitutional health care law.
Well, the Supreme Court has heard two cases before on the Affordable Care Act. Neither resulted in major changes to the law. I know you just gave the outlines of the case, but how is your particular case different for people who haven't been following all of the twists and turns as this issue has wound its way through the courts?
Our case relies on the Supreme Court's precedent specific to the Affordable Care Act and also its case law involving severability. In the first Affordable Care Act case, Chief Justice Roberts held that the individual mandate, this command for people to purchase health insurance, was unconstitutional, but because there was a penalty associated, then that could allow it to be construed as a tax. Now, later in 2017, Congress repealed that mandate, and so the sole basis with which the Supreme Court allowed the Affordable Care Act to continue no longer was in effect. What was left was the unconstitutional provision. At the same time, the Supreme Court has also held that the individual mandate is intertwined with the pre-existing condition regulations, such that they operate as the engine of the Affordable Care Act. And while the Supreme Court may not strike down the entirety of the Affordable Care Act, these regulations in Title I are what have caused health care to be so unaffordable in America today. And if those are struck down, that will take the engine out of the Affordable Care Act, defeat the central premise of the law, but also free up Americans to have regained control over their autonomy and their health care choices.
Is the nomination and all but certain confirmation of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court a good thing for your lawsuit?
Judge Barrett's focus and her pledge and commitment and self-description as a textualist, I believe, will cause her to address our case by looking and being controlled by the text of the Affordable Care Act, specifically on the issue of severability. And if that is, as I believe she has truthfully testified, how she approaches these types of cases and her thought process, then she is going to be persuaded by the text of the Affordable Care Act, where Congress specifically wrote in the Affordable Care Act that the individual mandate was, quote, essential to the regulatory scheme. So if Judge Barrett is properly and correctly guided and directed by the text of the statute, then she will agree that the individual mandate cannot be separated from the rest of the ACA, because that's how Congress wrote the law.
If the Supreme Court were to decide in your favor, what would you advise those millions of Americans who could lose their insurance?
Well, let me make the point, first of all, that you have nearly 15 million Americans today who qualify for insurance under the Affordable Care Act at no charge, but today still remain uninsured because they're not able to access care under the Affordable Care Act. The current failings in today's healthcare system are under 10 years of the Affordable Care Act. And so millions of Americans, even with Obamacare's guarantee of coverage, can't get care because it's beyond their cost or they're not able to access the doctor of their choice. But I would say, specific to this case, that when our case prevails, it doesn't change the private marketplace of health insurance. Doctors will still be giving care. Health insurance companies will still exist. Social programs like Medicaid and Medicare will continue to exist. The main change will be that the power of the federal government to come in and control people in their individual health care choices will be eliminated. And so people who have been harmed through the Affordable Care Act, like my client in this case, will now have empowerment over themselves to be able to go out and seek the health insurance and the health care that is actually best for themselves.
Rob Henneke, General Counsel at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, thank you very much for your time.
A pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Elaine.